The wind alone could have pushed her over. Yuki Tanaka stood 3 feet from the edge of Marpi Point, 18 years old, weighing less than 90 pounds. Below her, the Pacific Ocean waited 200 feet down, where the rocks had already claimed dozens of bodies that morning. The wind came off the water in gusts that made her sway like grass, and she could feel the older woman's hand locked around her wrist, pulling her forward, always forward, toward the place where the cliff ended and the air began. Behind her, moving through the tall grass on his hands and knees, Corporal Warren Mitchell was close enough to grab her ankle. 23 years old, from a small town in Oregon, he had been trained to kill the enemy. He had never been trained to save one. What happened in the next 4 seconds would determine whether Yuki Tanaka became another body on the rocks below Suicide Cliff or the most unlikely survivor of the Battle of Saipan. Mitchell lunged. His hand closed around Yuki's ankle just as Sachiko Yamada, the 45-year-old schoolteacher from Okinawa, pulled her forward with the strength of someone who had already decided that death was the only honorable path left. For one terrible second, all three of them teetered at the edge. The wind screamed, the ocean roared, and then Mitchell's weight pulled backward. Yuki fell onto the grass. Sachiko lost her grip and stumbled, but did not fall. Another Marine grabbed the older woman from behind and dragged her back from the edge, and she went limp in his arms like someone who had failed at the only task that mattered. Yuki screamed. She fought. She clawed at Mitchell's arms and kicked at his chest. She did not want to be saved. In her mind, forged by months of Japanese propaganda and the certainty that Americans were monsters who would do unspeakable things to captured women, this rescue was not mercy. It was the beginning of something worse than death. Mitchell held her tight, his arms wrapped around a body so thin that he could feel every rib through her clothing. He shouted for the interpreter. He shouted for a medic. He did not let go. That was how Yuki Tanaka survived the Battle of Saipan, not by choice, not by luck. By the hands of an enemy she had been taught to fear more than death itself. But the girl pulled from the cliff on that July morning was not the same person who would eventually leave an American military hospital 18 months later. What happened between those 2 moments between the cliff and the hospital gate is a story about hunger and healing, about hatred, and the slow, difficult work of seeing another human being clearly. And it begins not on Saipan but 2 months later in a medical facility in the Sacramento Valley of California, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. The blanket covering her was military-issue rough wool, and it seemed to weigh more than the person underneath it. Captain Brennan O'Connor stood in the doorway of the examination room at Camp Ellsworth Medical Facility, reviewing the intake file. September 1944. A transport from the Pacific had arrived that morning carrying wounded soldiers, German prisoners of war, and among them a small group of Japanese civilians requiring specialized medical care. One in particular had been flagged as critical. The stretcher came through the door, carried by 2 orderlies who moved with the careful precision of men transporting something fragile. O'Connor looked up from the file and saw a body so small that it barely raised the canvas. The blanket covered most of her, but he could see her face. Dark eyes half open in a face that had lost almost all of its softness. Cheekbones that cast shadows. Skin pulled tight over bone. She looked at him. He looked at her, and in that first second before the medical training took over, before the professional distance locked into place, Brennan O'Connor saw something that caught in his chest like a fishhook. She looked like someone who had already decided she was going to die and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The room began to fill. Nurse Eleanor Reed entered from the side door, clipboard in hand, her Minnesota efficiency already cataloguing what needed to be done. 2 medical assistants took positions near the examination table. An orderly stood by the door. And in the hallway just outside, visible through the open doorway, Kenneth Yoshida, the camp's Japanese interpreter, waited with the patient stillness of a man who had learned that the less space he took up, the safer everyone around him felt. They were all present for the same reason. This was not a routine intake. The file had made that clear. Critical malnutrition, possible organ failure, handle with extreme care. O'Connor began the examination. Temperature, pulse, blood pressure. Every number was wrong. Her heart was racing too fast for a body at rest. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. Her temperature wavered at the edge of hypothermia despite the warm California air that filled the room through the open windows. Then came the weighing. Two nurses lifted Yuki onto the scale with the gentleness of people handling something that might break. O'Connor adjusted the sliding weight, expecting a number that would be low, certainly, but manageable. He had treated malnourished soldiers before. He knew what starvation looked like. The weight marker dropped. It slid down the scale, down, and settled at 63 pounds. The room went silent. For 2 full seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the camp generator and the soft rustle of wind through the oak trees outside. Nurse Reed's clipboard clattered to the floor. She stared at the number, her hand rising slowly to her mouth. One of the medical assistants took an involuntary step backward, his face draining of colour. The orderly by the door whispered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a curse. In the hallway, Kenneth Yoshida removed his round spectacles and began polishing them slowly, mechanically, the way he always did when something shocked him beyond words. And Brennan O'Connor looked at the scale, then at the woman on it, then back at the scale again. 63 pounds. For an 18-year-old woman, even one of slight build, this was not merely thin. This was the body consuming itself to stay alive. Muscle tissue broken down for energy. Fat reserves long gone. Her organs operating under a strain that could cause any one of them to fail without warning. The fact that she was conscious that those dark eyes were watching him with something that was not quite fear and not quite defiance was a quiet miracle that defied every number on the chart. O'Connor's voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than usual, stripped of the brisk confidence that usually carried his orders through a busy hospital ward. Start a careful refeeding protocol, small portions, broth first, monitor electrolytes every 6 hours. If her potassium drops below 3.5, call me immediately, day or night. The staff moved. The protocol began. Nurse Reed retrieved her clipboard, her hands shaking slightly as she made the first notations. The assistants prepared the initial feeding tray. The orderly left to requisition the necessary supplies. But O'Connor stood by the scale for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the woman who weighed less than his medical bag and who was, whether he wanted it or not, now his responsibility. He turned and walked out of the examination room. He did not look back. But the number followed him. 63. It was the kind of number that settled into the bones and refused to leave. But the number was not the only thing that would keep Brennan O'Connor awake that night. The following morning, when the medical staff inventoried Yuki's personal belongings, they found 3 items wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth at the bottom of a small bag. A creased family photograph showing 4 people who smiled at a camera in a world that no longer existed. A piece of brown and silver paper folded with obsessive care, smoothed flat so many times that the printing had almost worn away. The wrapper from a Hershey's chocolate bar, and a medal. Japanese military issue, small as a silver dollar, with characters stamped into the metal that meant nothing to anyone in the room except Kenneth Yoshida. Anything with military markings was flagged for intelligence review. Nurse Reed brought it to O'Connor's office at 9:15 that morning, placed it on his desk, and left without a word. O'Connor turned the medal over in his fingers. The metal was warm from being carried close to a body for months, perhaps longer. He could feel the raised edges of the characters, the weight of whatever story they told. He carried it across the camp to the small office where Kenneth Yoshida worked. The older man looked up from his desk, saw the medal in O'Connor's hand, and reached for his glasses. "The inscription identifies this as a service medal," Kenneth said, after a long moment of examination. His English was precise, educated, touched with the formal grammar of a man who had once taught literature at a university in Tokyo. It belonged to Lieutenant Tanaka Kenji, Naval Air Unit, assigned to operations in the Gilbert Islands, November 1943. O'Connor heard the words, but they took a moment to reach the part of his brain that understood what they meant. The Gilbert Islands, November 1943, Tarawa. The medal belonged to the brother of the woman in his hospital. And that brother had served in the same campaign, the same battle, the same nightmare that had killed Owen O'Connor on a beach 8,000 miles from the restaurant in Boston where two brothers had shared a bowl of clam chowder and made promises about the future that only one of them would survive to remember. O'Connor took the medal back without a word. He walked to his quarters, a small room with a narrow bed and a desk and a window that looked out over the golden grass and scattered oak trees of the Sacramento Valley. He placed the medal on the desk beside the photograph of Owen and the bottle of whiskey that was already a quarter empty from the night before. He looked at the medal. He looked at the photograph. A Japanese naval aviator and an American Marine lieutenant connected by a battle that had chewed them both up and spit out nothing but grief. It had been a cold evening in January back in Boston, back when the war was something that happened to other people in places with names that were hard to pronounce. Brennan O'Connor sat across from his younger brother in a restaurant 3 blocks from the house where they had grown up, and he tried very hard to memorize the moment. Owen O'Connor was 22 years old, 6 feet tall, dark hair, an easy smile that made old men nod with approval, and young women look twice. He had enlisted in the Marines the week after Pearl Harbor, driven by something that Brennan recognized as both courage and recklessness in equal measure. Brennan had enlisted too, but the Army had looked at his medical degree and assigned him to a hospital unit. He would save lives, not take them. He would work behind the lines while Owen charged straight into the war. That evening in the restaurant, Owen ordered New England clam chowder, the thick kind with a cream base loaded with chunks of potato and tender clam meat served in a bread bowl with oyster crackers on the side. It was their mother's recipe, or close enough. The steam rose from the bowl and carried a smell that was pure Boston, pure childhood, pure home. Owen ate with the appetite of a young man who knew he might not eat this well again for a long time. Between spoonfuls, he talked about his unit, about training, about the Pacific. He did not talk about being afraid. The O'Connor boys had been raised not to talk about fear, the way other families did not talk about money or religion at the dinner table. You felt it certainly. You acknowledged it in the privacy of your own mind, but you did not give it voice. You did not let it take up space in a room. Brennan watched his brother eat and tried to memorize everything. The way Owen held the spoon, the way he laughed with his mouth full, the way he said, without any drama or ceremony, just a statement of fact thrown into the conversation between bites, "Save me a bowl when I get back." Brennan promised. Of course he promised. What else could he do? Owen shipped out the following week. He sailed to the Central Pacific, to a chain of islands called the Gilberts, to a tiny spit of land that most Americans had never heard of, a place called Tarawa. The battle lasted 76 hours. In those 3 days, more than 1,000 Marines were killed and 2,000 more were wounded. The Japanese garrison of nearly 5,000 men fought almost to the last man. Second Lieutenant Owen O'Connor was killed on the first day of the assault, November the 20th, 1943, on a beach that was supposed to have been cleared by naval bombardment, but was not. Brennan received the news by telegram. He was in the middle of surgery at a military hospital in Maryland when a nurse placed the folded paper on the instrument tray beside him. He read it between sutures. He did not stop operating. His hands did not shake. He finished the procedure, closed the incision with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times, washed his hands, walked to the supply room, closed the door behind him, sat down on a crate of bandages and wept for 40 minutes. A nurse heard him through the door, but did not enter. She stood outside and waited until the crying stopped, then walked away, without a word, without acknowledgement, giving him the dignity of grief that did not have to be explained or apologized for. From that day forward, Brennan O'Connor carried a weight that no surgical skill could remove. He should have been there. He should have been on that beach with Owen, using his training to stop the bleeding, to seal the wounds, to keep his brother alive until the stretcher bearers arrived. Instead, he had been 8,000 miles away, stitching up strangers in a clean, bright operating room that smelled of antiseptic instead of blood and seawater. He had been safe. Owen had not. Brennan requested a transfer to a frontline medical unit. The Army, noting his surgical expertise and the chronic shortage of experienced trauma surgeons in rear echelon facilities, assigned him instead to Camp Ellsworth Medical Facility, a military hospital and prisoner of war processing center in the Sacramento Valley of California. It was not the front line. It was not even close. But it was where the Army needed him, and Brennan O'Connor had been raised to do what was needed even when it was not what he wanted. He arrived at Camp Ellsworth in June of 1944, 1 month before the Battle of Saipan began. The camp sat on flat, dry land, surrounded by golden grass and scattered oak trees. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose in the distance like a wall between California and the rest of the continent. The air smelled of dust and dry heat, and when the wind came from the west, faintly of the Sacramento River. It was beautiful country, if you had the heart to notice. Brennan did not. He treated American soldiers with shrapnel wounds and broken bones, and the thousands small injuries of military life. He occasionally examined German prisoners of war who were generally healthy and cooperative, and seemed almost grateful for the 3 meals a day and the absence of artillery fire. He drank whiskey alone in his quarters every evening, not enough to impair his work the following day, just enough to sleep without dreaming of Tarawa and the beach where his brother had died among strangers. He kept one of Owen's dog tags around his neck. The other had been collected from the beach and filed with the Marine Corps records, a piece of stamped aluminum that was all the military could recover of a life that had ended too soon. He kept a photograph of Owen in his wallet. He did not make friends. He did not write home often. He waited for the war to end so he could go back to Boston and eat clam chowder in the restaurant where Owen's chair would always be empty. That was the man who sat in his quarters on the night after the 63-pound weighing, staring at a Japanese military medal and trying to reconcile the two truths that now occupied the same space in his mind. The woman in his hospital was the enemy. Her brother had flown missions over the islands where Owen had died, and now she was his patient, his responsibility, and if he walked away from her case, she would almost certainly die. Brennan O'Connor had written his medical school thesis on refeeding syndrome, the metabolic catastrophe that occurred when a severely malnourished body received nutrients too quickly. He knew with a precision that left no room for self-deception exactly what would happen if someone less familiar with the condition took over Yuki's care. They would see a starving patient and do the natural, compassionate thing. They would feed her. They would give her calories and protein and all the things a body needed to rebuild itself. And her depleted system, unable to process the sudden influx, would crash. Her phosphate levels would plummet. Her heart would go into arrhythmia. And she would die not from starvation, but from the kindness that killed her. There was no other doctor at Camp Ellsworth who had studied this. No one else who understood the delicate balance required to bring someone back from the edge without pushing them over it. If Brennan stepped away, Yuki Tanaka would die. It was that simple. He did not drink that night. He sat in the chair by the window listening to the sounds of the camp settling into darkness, and he thought about the choice in front of him: to save the life of a woman whose brother had served in the campaign that killed Owen, to spend his days monitoring her electrolytes and adjusting her feeding schedule and doing all the small, meticulous work required to keep a 63-pound body alive, or to sign the transfer paperwork and let someone else try. The dawn came slowly, painting the Sierra Nevada in shades of gold and pink. Brennan watched it rise. Then he stood, walked to the medical facility, picked up Yuki's chart, and wrote his first set of orders for the day. He called her the patient in his notes. He called her the prisoner when speaking to the staff. He did not call her by name. He performed his examinations with efficient precision, checking vitals, adjusting the feeding schedule, noting the small changes in her condition with the detached language of a man filling out a form for the army bureaucracy. He did not make eye contact longer than necessary. He did not speak to her except through medical instructions relayed to the nursing staff. He built a wall between himself and the woman on the other side of the clipboard, and for 2 weeks that wall held. But Eleanor Reed, Nurse Reed Ellie, to the few people she allowed close enough to use her first name, had a gift that walls could not stop. Ellie Reed had grown up on a dairy farm in southern Minnesota, the second of 5 children, the one who always ended up bottle-feeding the calves that their mothers had rejected. It was not a job anyone wanted. It meant sitting in a cold barn at 3 in the morning, holding a bottle to the mouth of a creature that did not yet trust you, waiting for the moment when hunger finally overcame fear and the feeding began. She had learned patience there in that barn in the pre-dawn darkness, with her breath fogging in the air and her hands going numb from the cold. Not the patience of philosophy or religion, but the patience of experience. The knowledge that some things could not be rushed. That trust was built in minutes and seconds, not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of showing up day after day, offering what you had, and waiting. She applied the same patience to Yuki Tanaka. Each morning, Ellie brought a tray to the bedside. In the first days, the tray held only a small bowl of clear chicken broth and a cup of water. Yuki would look at the food, then look at Ellie, then look away. Sometimes she drank, sometimes she did not. Ellie never pushed. She set the tray down, adjusted the blankets, checked the pulse, and sat in the chair beside the bed. She did not speak because there were no words they shared. She simply sat, present, steady, like a woman waiting for a calf to take the bottle. After the first week, Ellie made a change. She went to the camp kitchen and asked the cook, a heavy-set sergeant from Alabama who had never prepared Japanese food in his life, if he had any rice. The cook looked at her like she had asked for moon dust. But Ellie was persistent in the way that Minnesota farm girls learned to be persistent, which was to say, quietly, politely, and with the unshakable certainty that eventually you would get what you came for. She found a small bag of short-grain rice in the supply stores. She boiled it soft, thinned it with broth until it was almost a porridge, and brought it to Yuki on the morning tray. The steam rose from the bowl and filled the small room with a smell that did not belong in a California military hospital. It was the smell of cooked rice, plain and warm and ancient, a smell that belonged in a kitchen in Kobe where a mother stirred a pot while her daughter set the table and her husband read the newspaper, and the world had not yet torn itself apart. Yuki looked at the bowl. Her hands, which had been still on the blanket, moved toward it. She picked up the spoon, then set it down. Her fingers were shaking too badly to hold it steady. Ellie took the spoon. She filled it with a small amount of porridge, not too much, and held it near Yuki's mouth, not touching her lips, not forcing, just offering. The way you offer a bottle to a frightened calf. You hold it close, and you wait. Yuki opened her mouth. The rice porridge was not right. It was overcooked, slightly too thin, made from a variety of rice that was similar but not the same as what she had eaten every day of her life in Japan Before the war took her to Saipan and then to the cliff, and then to this room that smelled of medicine and now faintly of home. But it was warm, and it was rice. And for the first time since she had been dragged from the edge of Suicide Cliff, Yuki Tanaka cried. Not the screaming of the cliff when terror had ripped the sound from her throat, not the silence of the ship that had brought her across the Pacific when she had been too weak and too defeated to make any sound at all. This was different, a quiet, steady weeping that came from somewhere deeper than fear, from the place where the body remembers what home tastes like, even when the mind has given up on ever returning there. Ellie did not react. She did not comfort or console. She held the spoon and waited. When the crying slowed, she offered the spoon again. Yuki ate one spoonful, then another, then a third. She could not finish the bowl. Her stomach cramped after the fifth spoonful, and she turned her face away. But she had eaten more than she had eaten in any single sitting since arriving at Camp Ellsworth. Ellie noted it on the chart. Patient consumed approximately 1/3 cup rice porridge. Tolerated without immediate adverse reaction. She did not write about the crying. Some things did not belong in a medical record. From that morning forward, the rice porridge became part of the routine, and slowly, in increments so small that only a woman with the patience of a Minnesota farmer could have tracked them, Yuki began to eat. Her weight, which had stalled at 63 pounds for a terrifying week that had made even O'Connor's careful professional mask slip slightly, began to creep upward. 64 pounds, then 66. Each pound was a small victory measured on a metal scale in a room that smelled of antiseptic and increasingly of cooked rice. As Yuki's body began to recover, her mind began to wake up. The fog of starvation, which had kept the world blurred and distant for so long, started to lift. She began to notice things. The way Nurse Reed hummed under her breath while organizing the medicine cabinet, a melody that Yuki did not recognize but found oddly soothing, like a lullaby sung in a language she had never learned. The way a particular guard, a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from stone, held the door open an extra second when someone carried a heavy load. A small courtesy that seemed automatic, and therefore genuine. The way the California light changed throughout the day, from the pale grey of early morning to the fierce gold of afternoon, to the soft amber of sunset that painted the oak trees outside her window in colours she had never seen in Japan, where the light was always gentler, always filtered through mist or mountains or the dense press of buildings in a city like Kobe. She also noticed Private Billy Martinez. Billy was 19 years old from San Antonio, Texas, the grandson of a World War I veteran and the son of a mechanic who had wanted Billy to stay home and work in the shop, but who had signed the enlistment papers without argument when Billy said he wanted to serve. He had brown eyes and a sunburn that never quite faded, no matter how much time he spent indoors. He had a way of walking that was half march and half amble, as if his body could not decide whether it was on duty or on a Sunday stroll. Every day, Billy walked past Yuki's door on his patrol route. In the first weeks, he glanced in and kept moving. Then, he began to slow down. Then, he began to pause. One afternoon in mid-October, he stopped at her door. He reached into his pocket and placed a small orange flower on the windowsill. A California poppy, bright as a flame against the white paint. He did not say anything. He did not look at Yuki. He placed the flower and walked away, his boots clicking on the linoleum floor in a rhythm that Yuki would come to listen for each afternoon, the way a prisoner might listen for the footsteps that meant food was coming or danger, or the small mercies that made captivity bearable. Yuki did not understand the gesture. In the world she had been raised in, guards did not give prisoners flowers. Enemies did not offer beauty. She picked up the poppy and held it between her fingers. The petals were thin as paper, and the colour was so vivid that it almost hurt to look at. She placed it on the small table beside her bed, next to the folded Hershey's wrapper that she had carried from Saipan. 2 gifts from the enemy. She did not know what they meant, but she kept them. She also did not know that the young soldier who had placed that flower on her windowsill would within 6 weeks be lying in the bed next to hers with a fever that was climbing toward a number from which most men did not return, and that when that moment came, the only person in the camp who could help him would be the prisoner to whom he had given that flower. But that crisis was still weeks away, and in those weeks, while Yuki's weight slowly climbed towards 70 pounds, another presence made itself known in her small world. Corporal Frank Kowalski was 32 years old from Chicago, a man who had lost 3 friends on Guadalcanal and had carried that loss like a stone in his chest ever since. For the first 2 months of Yuki's time at Camp Ellsworth, Kowalski had refused to look at her. When his patrol route took him past her door, he kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, his face a mask of controlled anger that had nowhere to go and no one to punish. But something shifted in early October. It started with a grunt of acknowledgement when Nurse Reed asked him to step aside so she could pass with a tray. Then a nod when he saw Yuki sitting up in bed for the first time, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracking the movement of people in the corridor with the careful attention of someone learning the rhythms of a new and dangerous place. And then one morning in late October, a single word. Morning. He said it without breaking stride, without looking directly at her. He tossed the word over his shoulder like a man throwing a coin into a fountain without stopping to make a wish. But it was a word, and for a man who had lost friends to Japanese bullets, who had watched them die on a beach thousands of miles from home, it was a word that cost more than anyone watching could have guessed. Yuki heard it. She did not respond because she did not yet have enough English to know what response was expected. But she heard it, and she understood that something had changed. That the guard with the stone face and the careful distance had decided for reasons she could not fathom that she was worthy of a morning greeting. But not everyone in the camp was ready to see Yuki as anything other than the enemy. Inside the civilian detention section, separated from the hospital by a chain-link fence and 100 yards of dry California grass, Sachiko Yamada was conducting her own campaign. The woman who had tried to pull Yuki over the cliff on Saipan had survived the battle, survived the processing at Camp Susupe, survived the transport to California. But she had not survived her grief. It had hardened into something cold and absolute, a belief system that left no room for doubt or mercy. Sachiko visited the hospital during approved hours, sitting beside Yuki's bed and speaking in rapid, low Japanese that no American staff member could follow. Her message was consistent and relentless. You are eating their food, you are sleeping in their beds, you are letting their nurses touch you. Every day you stay alive in this place, you betray the women who chose honor on the cliff. Every bite of rice they give you is a chain around your neck. You are not recovering Yuki. You are surrendering. Yuki listened. Part of her, the part that had been raised in a culture where duty and honor were not abstract concepts, but the foundation of daily life, heard truth in Sachiko's words. After each visit, she ate less. Her weight gain, which had been slow but steady, plateaued. 68 pounds. 68 pounds. 68 pounds. 3 days in a row. Ellie noticed. Captain O'Connor noticed. Neither of them knew why. It was during one of these stalled days that Yuki overheard the conversation that changed everything. She was lying in bed with her eyes closed, not sleeping but resting in that grey space between wakefulness and unconsciousness, where the mind drifts and the body repairs itself. 2 voices passed in the corridor outside her door. One was Kenneth Yoshida, the interpreter. The other was a Japanese man. She did not recognize one of the male prisoners from another section of the camp. They were speaking Japanese, unaware that Yuki could hear them through the thin wall. "They want to transfer the girl," Kenneth said. his voice heavy with something that might have been resignation or might have been sadness. "To a camp in Arizona. There is no specialist there, no doctor who understands her condition." The other man asked what that meant. Kenneth paused before answering, and in that pause Yuki heard the weight of all the things he had seen in his years as an interpreter, all the small cruelties that happened when bureaucracy replaced human judgment. It means what it has always meant in places like this. She will be processed, she will be housed, she will be fed, according to the minimum requirements. And if her body cannot sustain itself on those minimums, there will be no one there who knows how to help. Yuki opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling at the water stain in the corner that looked like a map of an island she would never see again. Arizona. Transfer. No doctor. She understood enough to know what those words added up to. If she left Camp Ellsworth, she would enter a system that would keep her alive on paper and let her die in practice. Not through cruelty, through indifference, the most common killer in any war. That night alone in the dark, Yuki Tanaka had a conversation with herself. It was not dramatic. There was no flash of lightning, no sudden revelation. It was a slow, quiet argument between two versions of herself conducted in the privacy of her own mind, while the night guards walked their routes outside and the camp settled into the rhythmic silence of a military facility after lights out. One version was the girl who had stood on the edge of Suicide Cliff. The girl who believed that death was preferable to capture that survival in the enemy's hands was not survival at all, but a slow erasure of everything that made her Japanese. This version listened to Sachiko's words and heard truth in them. The other version was the girl who remembered her grandmother, not her father, the doctor who had treated the sick in Kobe with a combination of Western medicine and traditional herbs. Not her brother, the pilot who had been conscripted into a war he did not believe in. Not her mother, the quiet woman who had arranged flowers and kept house and never raised her voice, even when the bombs began to fall. Her grandmother, a small woman from a farming village outside Kobe who grew medicinal herbs in her garden and treated the neighbors' fevers and coughs with teas and poultices that she mixed in a stone mortar that had belonged to her own grandmother before her. Yuki's grandmother had never spoken about honor or duty or the emperor. She spoke about roots and seasons and the importance of surviving the winter. She said things that stayed with you, simple truths delivered in a voice that expected no argument, because the truth of them was self-evident. The brave thing is not to die, her grandmother had told her once when Yuki was 12 years old and had come home crying because a boy at school had mocked her for being small. Any fool can die. The brave thing is to wake up in the morning when waking up is the hardest thing in the world. Yuki thought about her grandmother's hands, rough and stained from years of grinding herbs. She thought about those hands pressing a warm cloth to her forehead when she was sick as a child. She thought about the stone mortar on the kitchen counter, heavy and cool, smelling of ginger, and something green that she could never quite identify, and she made her choice. Not for the Americans, not against Sachiko, not for any reason that could be expressed in the language of nations or armies or politics. She chose to live because her grandmother had taught her that living was the work and she was not yet finished. The next morning, Yuki ate her entire bowl of rice porridge. Then she asked for more. Ellie stared at her for a moment, then smiled and brought a second serving. Yuki ate that too. Her stomach ached. She did not care. She ate as if eating were an act of defiance, which in its own way it was. Within a week, her weight jumped to 72 pounds. Captain O'Connor noted the change with a clinical satisfaction that concealed something more personal, something he would not have admitted even to himself. He did not know what had shifted inside his patient, but he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had decided to fight. He had seen it in wounded soldiers who refused to die on the operating table, who held on through procedures that should have killed them, who woke up when they should have stayed unconscious and demanded to know when they could return to their units. He had never expected to see it in a Japanese prisoner who weighed less than his field kit. And then, on a cold morning in late November, everything changed because of a piece of barbed wire and a 19-year-old Texan who did not know when to stop working. Billy Martinez cut his hand while repairing a section of perimeter fence. The wire sliced deep across his palm a clean cut that bled freely but did not seem serious. Billy wrapped it in a handkerchief, finished his shift, and reported to the hospital for bandaging. The medic on duty cleaned the wound, applied sulfur powder, wrapped it in gauze, and sent Billy back to work. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. 3 days later, Billy woke with a fever of 102 degrees. The next morning it was 104. The wound on his hand, which should have been healing, was swollen and streaked with angry red lines that ran from his palm to his elbow. Infection, the kind that moved fast and did not forgive delay. Captain O'Connor examined Billy's hand and recognized the danger immediately. The infection was spreading toward the lymph nodes. If it reached the bloodstream, sepsis would follow. And sepsis in 1944, even with the best available treatment, killed more often than it cured. Billy needed penicillin. Administered intravenously, large doses, starting immediately. The problem was simple and devastating. Camp Ellsworth's supply of penicillin had been depleted. A shipment was expected in 48 hours. But Billy's infection was not going to wait 48 hours. O'Connor calculated the timeline in his head and did not like the arithmetic. 12 hours, maybe 18, before the infection crossed a threshold that antibiotics alone might not be able to reverse. He ordered cold compresses. He ordered the wound opened and drained. He did everything that a skilled surgeon could do with the tools at hand. But the tools at hand were not enough, and he knew it. Yuki knew it too. She had been watching from her bed, which was separated from Billy's by a thin curtain and 20 feet of linoleum floor. She heard O'Connor's clipped instructions. She heard the urgency that he tried to hide beneath professional calm. She heard Billy moaning through the fever, calling for his mother in a voice that sounded nothing like the cheerful young man who left poppy flowers on her windowsill. And she recognized what she was seeing. Infection spreading resistant to what the Americans were doing. Her father had treated infections like this in Kobe, not with the white powders and needles of Western medicine, but with the plants that grew in the garden behind their house. Plants that had names in Japanese that Yuki had memorized before she memorized the alphabet. Plants that her grandmother had taught her father, and that her father had taught her in the years before the war. Took everything except the knowledge itself. Yuki called for Kenneth. The interpreter came to her bedside, and she spoke to him in rapid Japanese. More words than she had spoken to anyone since arriving at Camp Ellsworth. She told him about her father. She told him about the herbs. She told him that she had seen a plant growing wild near the fence line of the camp, near a water spigot that dripped constantly and kept the ground beneath it soft and dark. A plant she recognized, a plant called dokudami in Japanese, known for its properties against inflammation and infection. She told him that it would not replace the American medicine, but that it might slow the infection enough to buy the time they needed. Kenneth listened. He polished his spectacles, a habit that meant he was thinking carefully about what to do next. Then he went to find Captain O'Connor. What happened next was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a conversation between two men standing in a corridor, speaking in low voices, while a 19-year-old boy burned with fever behind a closed door. Kenneth translated Yuki's words carefully, accurately, without adding his own opinion. O'Connor listened. His face did not change expression. When Kenneth finished, O'Connor was silent for what felt like a very long time. He was weighing the unweighable. Using an unverified herbal treatment on a United States Army private based on the recommendation of a Japanese prisoner of war was a violation of every medical protocol he had sworn to uphold. It could end his career. It could land him in a military court. And if the treatment failed, if the plant was toxic or ineffective or contaminated, Billy Martinez could die, and the blame would fall squarely on the shoulders of the doctor who had listened to the enemy. But Billy Martinez was already dying. Not quickly, not yet. But the trajectory was clear. 12 hours without penicillin. An infection that was winning the race. And on the other side of a thin curtain, a woman who said she knew a way to slow it down. "Show me the plant," O'Connor said. Yuki stood up from her bed. She was unsteady. 72 pounds did not provide much foundation for walking, and she had not been out of bed for more than a few minutes at a time in weeks. But her eyes were focused, her jaw was set, and when she moved toward the door, she moved with the purpose of someone who had somewhere to be, and would get there no matter what stood in the way. Ellie fell in beside her, one hand hovering near Yuki's elbow, ready to catch her if she stumbled. They walked to the back of the hospital compound, past the laundry building, past the storage shed, to a section of fence where the wild grass grew thick and untended, near a water spigot that dripped constantly, keeping the earth beneath it soft and damp. Yuki knelt down. Her fingers, still thin and trembling, moved through the grass with a precision that did not match her fragile appearance. She found what she was looking for, a low spreading plant with heart-shaped leaves and small white flowers thriving in the wet soil that the leaking spigot had created. She pulled several handfuls, roots and all, and held them up for O'Connor to see. She spoke to Kenneth. Kenneth translated. "Wash the leaves thoroughly, crush them into a paste, apply directly to the wound as a poultice. Also boil a portion in clean water for the patient to drink. Change the poultice every 4 hours. This will not kill the infection, but it will slow the spread and reduce the swelling. It will buy time." O'Connor looked at the plant in Yuki's hands. He looked at Yuki. This was the woman who weighed 63 pounds when she arrived, the woman whose brother served in the unit that was at Tarawa, the woman he had refused to call by name for weeks. She was kneeling in the dirt behind a military hospital in California, holding a fistful of weeds, offering to save the life of the boy who had given her a flower. The expectation was that enemies destroyed each other. The reversal was that this enemy was trying to heal. "Do it," O'Connor said. Ellie prepared the poultice under Yuki's instruction, translated through Kenneth in a chain of communication that moved from Japanese to English and back again with the strange efficiency of necessity. Yuki supervised every step. The leaves were washed in clean water, crushed in a bowl that Ellie borrowed from the kitchen, applied to Billy's swollen hand in a thick green layer that smelled of earth, and something sharp and medicinal that none of the American staff could identify. A second portion was boiled into a tea, dark and bitter, that Billy, semi-conscious, drank without protest, because he was beyond caring what it tasted like. Yuki sat beside Billy's bed for the next 6 hours, watching the poultice, checking for changes in the color of the skin around the wound, adjusting the compress when it dried out. She did this with the quiet competence of someone performing a task she had learned long before she learned to be afraid. Ellie sat on the other side, monitoring Billy's vital signs. O'Connor came in every hour, checked the chart, looked at Yuki, looked at Billy, and left without saying more than was necessary. At midnight, Billy's fever dropped from 105 degrees to 103. Still dangerous, but the direction had changed. At 6 in the morning, the red streaks on his arm had stopped advancing. The swelling around the wound had decreased slightly. Billy opened his eyes. He looked at Yuki sitting beside him and said something in a voice cracked by fever and confusion. She did not understand the words, but his tone was clear. It was the tone of a man recognizing that someone was trying to help him. 24 hours later, the penicillin shipment arrived. O'Connor administered the antibiotic immediately and continued the herbal poultice in alternation, following Yuki's instructions through Kenneth. Within 48 hours, Billy's fever broke completely. His arm was saved. The infection retreated. The 19-year-old from San Antonio, who had given a prisoner a poppy flower, was going to live because that prisoner had given him something in return. But what happened in that hospital room? The enemy prisoner kneeling beside the American soldier's bed, her trembling hands pressing leaves against his burning skin, would set off a chain of consequences that none of them could have foreseen. Word traveled through the camp the way all news travels in confined spaces, quickly and with embellishment. By sundown, every guard, every officer, every prisoner knew that the Japanese girl in the hospital had used some kind of plant medicine to help save Private Martinez. Reactions varied. Some guards nodded with something that might have been respect. Others shook their heads and muttered about regulations, about lines that should not be crossed, about the dangers of letting the enemy get too close. Among the Japanese prisoners, the story carried a different weight. A Japanese woman had used Japanese knowledge to save an American life. Some saw it as proof that cooperation was possible, that perhaps the propaganda about American cruelty had been exaggerated. Others, following Sachiko's line, saw it as collaboration with the enemy, a betrayal of everything that made resistance meaningful. But the reaction that mattered most came from Major Luther Garrett's office, and it came in the form of paperwork. Garrett was 46 years old, the administrative officer responsible for resource allocation at Camp Ellsworth. He was a precise man who believed in systems and procedures in the proper distribution of limited supplies. His hair had gone grey early, his posture was military straight, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made people lean forward to listen, which meant they caught every word and missed nothing. He did not shout, he did not threaten. He filed paperwork, and paperwork in the United States Army was more powerful than any weapon. Garrett filed a new report within 24 hours of Billy's recovery. The report was precise, thorough, and devastating. Point 1. A prisoner of war had been given unsupervised physical access to an American military patient, constituting a breach of security protocol. Point 2. An unapproved and unregulated treatment had been administered to an American serviceman under the direction of an enemy prisoner, constituting a breach of medical protocol. Point 3. The personal relationship between camp personnel and the prisoner had exceeded professional boundaries, constituting a security risk. Garrett did not mention that Billy Martinez was alive because of that breach. He did not need to. His report was not about outcomes. It was about process. And in the United States Army, process was the only language that mattered. Colonel Howard Mitchell read the report and called a hearing. The hearing took place in the camp's main office, a room that smelled of coffee and old paper, and the particular tension of men who were about to make a decision they did not want to make. The panel consisted of Mitchell, Garrett, and 2 administrative officers whose names O'Connor did not catch and would not remember. O'Connor stated his case plainly. Private Martinez had a life-threatening infection. Penicillin was unavailable. The prisoner offered a treatment based on traditional medical knowledge. The treatment was effective. The patient survived. Garrett responded with equal plainness. The prisoner was given access to a patient she should never have been allowed to touch. The treatment was unregulated and untested by any recognized medical authority. The precedent this sets is dangerous. If we allow prisoners to participate in the medical care of American soldiers, we open the door to scenarios that cannot be controlled. Mitchell asked O'Connor a single question. Can you guarantee this will not happen again? O'Connor could not. Because if the same situation arose tomorrow, if another soldier lay dying, and the conventional supplies were exhausted, and a prisoner offered knowledge that could help, O'Connor would make the same decision. He knew it. Garrett knew it. Mitchell knew it. The panel ruled Yuki Tanaka would be transferred to a detention facility in Arizona within 10 days, unless a compelling medical reason prevented the transfer. The ruling was not punishment, not in the language of the military. It was a reallocation of resources and a restoration of protocol, but the effect was the same. In 10 days, Yuki would leave the hospital where she had been brought back from the edge of starvation. She would enter a system that had no Brennan O'Connor, no Ellie Reed, no rice porridge, no poppy flowers on the windowsill. O'Connor returned to his quarters after the hearing and closed the door. He opened the whiskey bottle. He poured 2 fingers into the glass and stared at it without drinking. On the desk in front of him was Yuki's medical file, the medal and the photograph of Owen. 3 objects that had no business being in the same room, but that the war had forced together like shrapnel in a wound. He thought about signing the transfer paperwork. It would be easy. A signature, a date, a file closed. Yuki would disappear into the system and he would never have to look at her again. He would never have to think about the medal or the unit at Tarawa, or the 63 pounds that had settled into his memory like a stone at the bottom of a well. He picked up the pen. He held it over the paper, and in that moment balanced between signing and not signing, Brennan O'Connor saw something in his mind that he had not expected. Not Owen, not the beach at Tarawa. He saw Yuki kneeling in the dirt behind the hospital, pulling weeds, with hands that could barely hold themselves steady, offering those weeds to save the life of a boy who was supposed to be her enemy. He saw the look on her face as she sat beside Billy's bed through the night, watching the poultice, checking the skin, doing the work with a concentration that had nothing to do with nations or flags, and everything to do with the simple human refusal to let someone die when you know how to help. He put the pen down. That evening, there was a knock on O'Connor's door. He opened it and found Major Luther Garrett standing in the quarters, his uniform immaculate as always, his silver hair catching the overhead light. Garrett's expression was controlled, but his eyes held something O'Connor had never seen there before. Not anger, not the cold precision of a man building a case, something rarer than that, something that looked, if O'Connor had to name it, like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and was approaching the limit of what his arms could bear. "May I come in, Captain?" Garrett said. It was not really a question. O'Connor stepped aside. Garrett entered the room, glanced at the whiskey bottle on the desk, noted without comment that it appeared to be at the same level it had been for weeks, and sat down in the wooden chair opposite O'Connor's desk without waiting to be invited. For a moment, neither man spoke. The sounds of the camp filtered through the thin walls, a generator humming, boots on gravel, the distant metallic clang of the mess hall being cleaned after dinner. Garrett spoke first. His voice was steady the way it always was, but the steadiness had a quality to it now that felt less like control and more like the final reserves of a man who had been controlling himself for so long that the effort had become indistinguishable from who he was. "Captain O'Connor, do you know how my son died?" O'Connor knew the outline. Everyone at Camp Ellsworth knew the outline. Lieutenant William Garrett, Philippines. Bataan, 1942, killed in action. The details beyond that were private, locked behind a door that the major never opened in public. "The death march, sir," O'Connor said. "Bataan." Garrett shook his head. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of 2 years of correcting a misunderstanding that he had never bothered to correct before. Because correcting it meant telling the full story, and telling the full story meant reliving it. "William survived the march," Garrett said. He told the story then in a voice that stayed level through sheer force of will. 70 miles in the heat, no water, men collapsing around his son, Japanese guards beating anyone who fell behind. William made it. He was strong. He had his father's stubbornness and his mother's endurance. He arrived at Camp O'Donnell, more dead than alive, but he arrived. He survived dysentery in the first month. He survived a beating from a guard who did not like the way he looked at him. He survived on rations that would not have kept a child alive. Rice full of weevils and water that tasted of rust. He lost 50 pounds. His hair started falling out. But he was alive. He wrote letters that never reached them, but they learned later that he wrote them. He wrote to his mother and told her he was fine. He was not fine, but he was alive. Then William got malaria, Garrett said. His voice cracked, not dramatically, not with a sob or a shout. It cracked the way old wood cracks along a grain that has been under pressure for years, splitting slowly and quietly and completely. In the camp, there was a Japanese medical officer, a doctor. William's bunkmates carried him to the infirmary and asked for quinine. The Japanese doctor had quinine. They could see it on the shelf behind him in glass bottles clearly labeled. The doctor looked at William. He looked at an American boy who was shaking so hard that his teeth were rattling and his eyes were rolling back in his head, and the doctor turned around and walked away. Garrett paused. He looked at the wall behind O'Connor's head, at a point somewhere beyond the plaster and the wood and the California night. He did not treat William because William was American, not because there was no medicine, not because there was no time, because treating an American prisoner was not worth the effort. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of two men who understood each other. It was the terrible silence that follows when someone has opened a door that cannot be closed again. My boy died that night, Garrett said, shaking on a bamboo floor in a camp in the Philippines. The men in his barrack said they could hear his teeth chattering through the walls. They said it went on for hours and then it stopped. Garrett looked directly at O'Connor for the first time since sitting down. So, when I see you spending our penicillin, our nursing hours, our electrolytes on a Japanese prisoner, I do not see mercy, Captain. I see my son lying on a bamboo floor in the Philippines, and I see a Japanese doctor walking away. O'Connor understood in that moment with a clarity that cut through every argument and counter-argument he had constructed over the past weeks. Garrett was not a bureaucrat protecting resources. Garrett was a father whose son had been killed by indifference wearing a medical coat. Every form he filed, every transfer he requested, every calculation of nursing hours and electrolyte costs was not about efficiency. It was about a glass bottle of quinine on a shelf and a doctor who turned his back. O'Connor was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, stripped of the professional distance that had protected him for months. "I understand, sir. I lost my brother at Tarawa." Garrett nodded, slowly acknowledging the shared territory of grief, without claiming that one loss was greater than the other. "Then how can you do this?" Garrett said. "How can you spend your days keeping her alive when you know what her people did to your brother and to my son?" O'Connor looked at the whiskey bottle. He looked at Owen's photograph. He looked at the medal on the desk, the small stamped piece of metal that had once represented the enemy and now represented something far more complicated. And he said the words that he had not known he was going to say until they were already out of his mouth. Because if I become the man who walks away from a patient, then I am the Japanese doctor in that camp. And your son died for nothing. The words hung in the room. Garrett stared at O'Connor. O'Connor held the stare. Two men on opposite sides of the same grief, looking at each other across a desk that was too small in a war that was too large, and a question that neither of them would ever fully answer. Garrett stood. He straightened his uniform with the automatic precision of 30 years of military habit. He looked at O'Connor once more, and in that look there was something that was not agreement and not forgiveness, but was perhaps the beginning of an understanding that some arguments cannot be won because both sides are right and the real enemy is not in the room. Garrett left without another word. He walked down the quarters, his footsteps measured and even, and he returned to his office and sat at his desk and did not file another transfer request for Yuki Tanaka. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not ever. He did not become an ally. He did not visit the hospital or ask about Yuki's progress. He simply stopped. And in the mathematics of war, where destruction is active and mercy is often just the absence of hostilities stopping, was enough. The winter gave way to the early green of a California spring. In the hospital, Yuki's weight climbed steadily. 80 pounds by February, 85 by March, 90 by April. The bones that had stood out like architecture under her skin began to disappear beneath new layers of muscle and fat. Her face filled out. Her hands stopped trembling. She could walk the full length of the hospital corridor without stopping to rest. One afternoon in early April, Billy appeared at the hospital door with something in his hand. Not a flower this time, an apple. A golden delicious grown somewhere in the Sacramento Valley, its skin pale yellow and smooth as polished stone. He held it out to Yuki without a word. She took it. The apple was heavy for its size, cool from the outdoor air. She bit into it, and the flesh broke with a clean snap, the juice running down her chin, sweet and bright and tasting of nothing she had ever eaten in Japan. In Kobe, the apples were small and crisp and faintly tart. This California apple was different, softer, sweeter, almost perfumed. She ate it slowly, standing by the window, looking out at the oak trees that were showing the first pale green of new leaves. Billy stood outside, arms crossed, watching the same trees eating his own apple. They did not speak. They did not need to. Two people eating apples on a spring afternoon, separated by a window and a war and everything that should have made this moment impossible. And yet, here it was. And then, in August, the world changed. The news came over the camp radio on August 6, 1945. A single bomb had been dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The word atomic was used, a word that most of the people listening had never heard attached to a weapon before. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, and on August the 15th, the Emperor of Japan addressed his people by radio for the first time in history and told them that the war was over. At Camp Ellsworth, the American personnel celebrated with the wild relief of people who had been living under the shadow of death for 4 years and had suddenly been told that the shadow was lifting. There was shouting and singing and unauthorized whiskey and a spontaneous baseball game on the parade ground that devolved into a joyful chaos of men hugging each other and weeping without shame. Among the Japanese prisoners, the reaction was different. Some sat in stunned silence. Some wept openly, not from relief, but from a grief so complete that it had no bottom. Their country had surrendered. The emperor had spoken. Everything they had been taught to believe, everything they had been willing to die for, was over. The structure that had given their suffering meaning had collapsed, and they were left holding the wreckage without instructions. Yuki sat on her hospital bed and listened to the radio broadcast being translated by Kenneth into Japanese for the prisoners who could not understand English. She heard the words, "Unconditional surrender, atomic bomb, the war is over." She thought about Kobe. She knew that her city had been firebombed in March of that year. Hundreds of American B-29 bombers had dropped incendiary bombs that turned entire neighborhoods to ash. She did not know if her father was alive. She did not know if the house where she grew up still stood. She did not know if the herb garden behind the house, her grandmother's garden, had survived the fire. She sat very still and held the folded Hershey's wrapper in her hand, the paper soft from months of handling the printing, almost worn away. It was the first thing the enemy had given her. Now the enemy had won, and the country that wrapper came from had dropped a weapon on 2 of her cities that had killed more people in seconds than the Battle of Saipan had killed in a month. Yuki did not know how to hold all of these things at once, the gratitude and the grief, the mercy she had received, and the destruction her country had suffered, the doctor who had saved her life, and the pilots who had burned her city. She sat on the bed and held the wrapper, and did not cry and did not speak, and waited for someone to tell her what happened next. A week after the war ended, something happened that would change the way Brennan O'Connor understood everything that had come before. Kenneth Yoshida appeared at the hospital with a folder of declassified Japanese military records. The intelligence division had been processing documents from surrendered units, and among them Kenneth had found something he thought O'Connor needed to see. They sat in the small office where O'Connor wrote his reports. Kenneth opened the folder and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. It was a record of service for Lieutenant Tanaka Kenji Naval Air Unit, Gilbert Islands Campaign, November 1943. "I thought you should know the full story," Kenneth said quietly. O'Connor read the document. Then Kenneth translated the parts written in military code, the parts that told what really happened on the day that connected Kenji Tanaka to the beach where Owen O'Connor died. Lieutenant Tanaka had been ordered to bomb American positions on the landing beaches at Tarawa. He had flown his aircraft over those beaches on November the 20th, 1943. He had seen the Marines crawling through the surf and the smoke and the gunfire. He had seen the chaos below the bodies in the water, the men dying in the sand. And he had not released his bombs. He had turned his aircraft toward the open ocean and dropped his payload into the water, far from any target, far from any human being. When he returned to base, his commanding officer had asked for his report. Kenji had told the truth. He said he could not bring himself to kill men who were already dying. He said that dropping bombs on them would not change the outcome of the battle, would not serve. Japan would only add more death to a beach that was already soaked with it. His commanding officer had executed him that same afternoon. The charge was cowardice. The method was a bullet to the back of the head. The medal that now sat in Yuki's belongings was not a reward for service. It was compensation sent to a family for a son the military had murdered for refusing to murder others. O'Connor sat very still. Kenneth folded the papers and placed them back in the folder. "The girl's brother," Kenneth said, "tried to save your brother, and they killed him for it." O'Connor stood up from his chair. He walked out of the office, past the wards, out to the edge of the camp where the fence ended and the golden grass began. He walked for 2 hours. When he came back, his eyes were red, and his jaw was set in a way that spoke of something fundamental rearranging itself inside him. That night, for the first time since Owen's death, Brennan O'Connor did not think about the whiskey bottle in his desk. He sat by the window and looked at the photograph of his brother, and he said aloud to the empty room, "She tried to save you, Owen. Her brother tried to save you, and they killed him for it." The room did not answer, but the silence that followed was different from the silences before. It was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of a man who had been given a new piece of information and was not yet sure what to do with it, but knew that everything from this point forward would be shaped by what he decided. What happened next was paperwork. Repatriation orders were processed. Ships were being prepared to carry prisoners of war back across the Pacific. Medical staff evaluated each prisoner's fitness to travel. Yuki's file, with its long record of weight gain and recovery, was marked as cleared for transport. She would sail from San Francisco to Yokohama, and from there she would make her way home or to whatever remained of home. The day came in late January of 1946. A cold, clear California morning, the sky so blue it looked painted, the air smelling of frost and eucalyptus. Yuki was given simple clothing, clean and new, and her personal belongings were returned in a small cloth bag. The photograph of her family, the Hershey's wrapper, the dried poppy flower pressed flat between 2 pieces of cardboard that Ellie had cut for her, and the medal. Kenji's medal, the piece of stamped metal that had once nearly broken Brennan O'Connor and had ended up being the key that unlocked the truth between them. Yuki walked through the hospital one final time. Her steps were steady now, 102 pounds. Not fully recovered, still thinner than she should have been, but strong enough to walk without assistance, strong enough to carry her own bag, strong enough to stand straight and look the world in the eye without swaying. Ellie Reed was waiting in the corridor outside the examination room where Yuki had first been weighed 16 months and 39 pounds ago. The nurse from Minnesota stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression caught between professional composure and something less disciplined that she was trying very hard to control. She handed Yuki a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pocket medical handbook, the kind that field nurses carried, compact and sturdy with a flexible cover designed to survive rough handling. On the first page in handwriting that was neat and practical and slightly slanted to the right, Ellie had written, "For the best nurse I ever trained, Ellie, Minnesota." Yuki held the book. She understood enough English now to read the inscription. She looked at Ellie. Then she bowed, not the small nodding bow of daily courtesy. A deep formal bow bending at the waist, her eyes lowered, held for a long count of seconds. In Japanese culture, this bow was reserved for moments of profound gratitude, the kind of gratitude that cannot be expressed in words because words are too small and too temporary for what they need to carry. Ellie did not know any of this. She saw a young woman bending forward and she felt her own eyes sting and she said, "You're going to be fine, honey." Then she turned and walked quickly down the corridor because she was not the kind of woman who cried in front of people, and she was not about to start now. Billy Martinez stood at the camp gate, his hat in his hands. His palm bore the scar that connected him to Yuki in a way that no document or official record would ever capture. He raised his hand in a wave. Yuki raised hers. Two people saying goodbye across a distance that was measured not in feet, but in everything that should have kept them from acknowledging each other, and had failed. Corporal Kowalski was stationed at the gate post. When Yuki approached, he did something that made every guard within eyeshot stop and stare. He drew himself to attention, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand to his brow in a formal military salute. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he dropped his hand and returned to his post without a word. Kowalski had never saluted a prisoner before. He would never salute one again. But on that January morning, with the California light catching the frost on the barbed wire and the mountains standing clean and white against the sky, it was the only gesture that seemed adequate for a woman who had arrived on a stretcher weighing 63 pounds and was leaving on her own feet. Brennan O'Connor was waiting outside the gate. He had positioned himself away from the others, standing alone beside the dirt road that led from the camp to the highway. He was not wearing his medical coat. He was in his officer's uniform, pressed and correct, his hands at his sides. His face was composed in the way that surgeons' faces are always composed, trained to show nothing to give away, nothing to keep the steady mask in place, no matter what is happening underneath. Yuki walked to him. They stood facing each other. Kenneth was not there. No interpreter, no translator, no bridge of words between their languages. This was deliberate. Some conversations do not need words. Some conversations are ruined by them. Brennan reached into his pocket and took out 2 objects. The first was Kenji's medal. He had kept it since the day of the inventory, locked in his desk drawer, unable to return it and unable to throw it away. Now he placed it in Yuki's palm. The metal was cold from the January air. The second object was Owen's dog tag, the small stamped rectangle of metal that Brennan O'Connor had worn around his neck every day since receiving the news of his brother's death. O'Connor, Owen M. service number, blood type, the essential facts of a life reduced to letters pressed into aluminum. He had taken it off that morning for the first time in over 2 years. The skin beneath it was paler than the rest of his neck, a ghost outline of the chain that had held it in place. He placed the dog tag beside the medal in Yuki's hand. She looked down. 2 pieces of metal, one Japanese, one American. One for a pilot who refused to drop his bombs and was killed by his own people. One for a Marine who died on a beach that the pilot could not bring himself to bomb. 2 young men from opposite sides of the world who had never met and who were now held together in the palm of a woman who weighed 102 pounds and had once weighed 63. Yuki closed her fingers around both objects. She understood. She did not need Kenneth to translate what Brennan was saying. He was saying that these two pieces of metal belonged together, that Owen and Kenji were not enemies, that they were both casualties of the same machine, ground up by the same gears, and that the only thing left to do with their memory was to hold it gently and refuse to let it become hatred. Yuki reached into her own pocket and took out a piece of paper folded small and tight. She had written on it the night before, sitting in her hospital bed with a pen that Ellie had lent her, filling the small page with careful Japanese characters. She placed the paper in Brennan's hand. Brennan looked at the folded paper. He did not open it. Not now, not in front of her. He closed his hand around it and nodded once, a small downward movement of his head that carried more weight than any words he could have spoken in any language. Yuki bowed. Brennan nodded. Their eyes met for the last time. Then Yuki turned and walked to the waiting military transport, climbed into the back with the other repatriated prisoners, and sat down on the wooden bench. She did not look back through the window. She did not need to. She had already seen everything she needed to see in his face. Brennan stood on the dirt road and watched the vehicle until it disappeared into the golden distance of the Sacramento Valley, growing smaller and smaller against the backdrop of the Sierra Nevada, until it was a dark speck, and then nothing. He stood there for several minutes after the vehicle was gone, his hand in his pocket, his fingers closed around the folded piece of paper. Then he walked back to his quarters, sat down at his desk, and placed the paper in the wooden box that held Owen's photograph and the empty space where the dog tag had been. He did not open the letter. He would not open it for the rest of his life. Not because he did not want to read it, but because he could not read Japanese, and some part of him believed that the meaning of the letter existed not in the words themselves, but in the act of giving it and the act of keeping it. Translating it felt like it would reduce something sacred to something ordinary, so the letter stayed in the box folded and unread for 59 years. Yuki Tanaka returned to Japan in the spring of 1946. The country she came home to was not the country she had left. Cities lay in ruins. Her father was alive, living in a village outside Kobe, still growing herbs in borrowed soil. When he saw her, he did not recognize her at first. Then he looked at her eyes and knew. He held his daughter while the afternoon light moved across the hills and the herbs grew around their feet. Yuki carried Ellie's medical handbook for the rest of her life. She enrolled in medical school in 1948, one of the first women admitted to Kobe University in the post-war era. She became a doctor. She practiced for 35 years, specializing in what she called integrated medicine, combining Western clinical practice with traditional Japanese herbal knowledge. She trained dozens of young doctors and told each of them the same thing her grandmother had told her. The brave thing is not to die. The brave thing is to wake up in the morning when waking up is the hardest thing in the world. In the drawer of her desk beside the stethoscope she used every day, Yuki kept 3 things: the Hershey's wrapper from Saipan, the dried poppy flower from Billy Martinez, and a small cloth bag containing 2 pieces of metal, Kenji's medal, and Owen O'Connor's dog tag. They sat together in the dark of that drawer for decades, touching each other the way their owners never could. In her home on a wooden altar, 2 photographs sat side by side. One showed a young man in a naval flight uniform. The other was not a photograph, but a piece of paper on which Yuki had written in careful English, Owen M. O'Connor, born 1921, died November the 20th, 1943, Tarawa. Every morning for 50 years she lit incense for both of them. Yuki died in 2003 at the age of 77. Brennan O'Connor returned to Boston in 1948. He opened a private practice 3 blocks from the restaurant where he and Owen had shared their last bowl of clam chowder. He married a schoolteacher named Margaret. They had 3 children. He stopped drinking the year his first daughter was born. He placed the whiskey bottle in a cabinet and never opened it again. When his wife asked about the wooden box in the attic, the one with Owen's photograph, and the folded letter, and the empty chain, he told her about Owen, about Tarawa, about the clam chowder. He did not tell her about Yuki, not because he was ashamed, but because he did not have the words to explain what had happened between them, without making it sound like something it was not. Brennan O'Connor died in 1996 at the age of 87. His funeral was held at St. Patrick's Church in South Boston. No one mentioned Camp Ellsworth. No one mentioned a Japanese woman who had weighed 63 pounds. The box stayed in the attic. In 2005, 9 years after Brennan's death, and 2 years after Yuki's, a woman named Sarah O'Connor, Hayes climbed the stairs to her grandparents' attic in South Boston. She was cleaning out the house and found the box. Inside Owen's photograph, an empty chain, and a piece of paper folded tight, yellowed with age, covered in Japanese characters. She took the letter to Boston University. A professor translated it while Sarah listened to the voice of a woman who had been dead for 2 years, speaking through words written 60 years before. Dear Captain O'Connor, I cannot say these words to you because I do not have enough English, and because some words are too heavy for any language. You saved my life when I did not want to be saved. For a long time I hated you for that. Now I understand. What you gave me was not life, it was a choice. The choice to become something other than what the war made me. My brother Kenji chose not to drop his bombs. You chose not to walk away from my bed. These are small choices. But I believe the world is changed by small choices, not by bombs. I will keep your brother's name with my brother's name. They will sit together on my family's altar. They will be remembered together. Tanaka, Yuki. Sarah searched the internet. She found Dr. Yuki Tanaka's obituary. She found Dr. Hana Tanaka, Yuki's granddaughter, a physician at Kobe University Hospital. She wrote a letter. 6 months later, Sarah flew to Kobe. They met in the hospital lobby, where Yuki had worked for 35 years. Hana brought a small wooden box. Inside were 2 pieces of metal, Kenji's medal and Owen's dog tag, which had lain together in Yuki's desk for 60 years. My grandmother kept your great-uncle's name on our family altar, Hana said, next to my great-uncle Kenji. They have been together for 60 years. Sarah lifted Owen's dog tag. The letters were worn but legible. O'Connor, Owen M. The essential facts of a life that had ended too soon. Then, standing in the lobby of a hospital in Kobe, Japan on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn of 2005, the granddaughter of an American doctor and the granddaughter of a Japanese prisoner embraced. They held each other the way strangers hold each other when they discover they are not strangers at all, but members of a family created not by blood, but by a choice made in a military hospital in California on a day when the right thing to do and the hard thing to do were exactly the same thing. 63 pounds. That is where the story began. 102 pounds. That is where the war let go. And somewhere between those 2 numbers, in a hospital room in California, where the windows faced the Sacramento Valley and the oak trees turned gold, in the autumn light, a doctor and a prisoner made a choice too small to appear in any history book and too large to be forgotten by anyone who carries their names. This is the story of Yuki Tanaka. This is the story of Brennan O'Connor. And if you are listening now from the United States or from Japan or from any corner of this world that has ever known war, then their story is not over. Because every time someone chooses mercy when hatred would be easier, every time someone sees a person where they expected an enemy, every time someone refuses to walk away from a human being who needs help. The choice that Brennan O'Connor made in that examination room in 1944 is made again. And the world quietly imperceptibly in a way that no scale can measure and no chart can record, gains another pound.